Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to item 8. Resolution 2011-31 is a conflict of interest policy that's been before the board in draft form on several occasions. At this point, I'll ask Bob Zinkowski to give us a little lead into this discussion.
Sure. This is something that the auditors have recommended that the township put into place a conflict of interest policy. I believe the notation has been made by the auditors for this. This is something that we had introduced last summer, and it's gone through a number of revisions, and we feel that this encompasses the areas in which disclosure needs to be made. And I'm sure this is one, again, as we continue to go through this process and through a year of working through this, we'll probably continue to keep refining this and continue to keep working with the auditors to make sure we have a very good conflict of interest policy in place.
I'll move the approval of the resolution.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any commissioner comment?
I have a couple of questions for John Rice in particular. There's a couple of gaps in my opinion. Again, I'm not opposed to this, but I think there may be something to look at for the future. The first thing is, it seems to me, if I read this and understand it correctly, it's incumbent upon the individual to disclose that conflict of interest. And there's no provision in here that if somebody brings it to our attention, how it gets addressed. The second thing, which concerned me slightly, is if you look at the way it's laid out, it says, following disclosure of the possible conflict of interest, the Board of Commissioners votes. And there was no provision for you as our advisor to advise us whether or not, in your opinion, there was a conflict of interest. We could always ask you, but it's not.
I think I would most likely be involved in giving you that opinion if it comes up.
Right. So do you think we should somewhere downstream adjust this to formalize that, or just rely on our judgment to ask you?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary to add that the solicitor gets to give you legal advice at some point. I'm going to be doing that anyway.
How do you, I'm sorry, John, I thought you were done.
No, go ahead.
And how do you propose we deal with the gap that if it was brought to our attention through means other than self-disclosure?
Well, it's going to, if someone, whether it's anonymously or otherwise, brings a, and remember, we're dealing with volunteers and committees. Some of the individuals may not even be aware that, that there's certain things that may fall under here as a conflict of interest. So if it comes out at some point through some anonymous complaint or some other source, then administratively, what I would suggest we do is have that person, we would have to review it, have that person fill out the form. I mean, this is going to be a compliance issue. It's something that we started to do with real estate a couple of years ago.
So your proposal to address that situation is, if it comes to our attention, we question the individual involved and ask them to complete the form and either disclose it or claim that there is no conflict.
Or have a discussion as to, if it's not something that a board member or a commission member or a committee member discloses on the annual form, which is part of this policy, then there would have to be discussion with the administration, myself, if necessary, to get involved. And then if it looks as if it meets the definition, we'd ask that individual to fill the form out.
I think as part of this too, Kevin, would be the training processes. If the board adopts this policy, then we would have meetings with the various boards and commissions and let them understand what is expected from all those board members.
One last question, Bob. Have you reviewed this with the auditors? Does this fulfill their requirements and such that we won't get that finding in next year's audit?
A good portion of this came from a template they had provided to us.
Bob, a housekeeping type issue on the actual disclosure form. The check boxes where they say conflict of interest, that should be title cased and italicized, so it's clear that it's a definition. where it says, I have no conflict of interest, for example?
Any-
A couple of, yeah, a
Go
few
ahead.
questions. John Rice, typically, these documents, appearance of conflict or perceived conflict, because that could be so broad, I just want to know if that's not too broad.
Well, I think we're looking at trying to capture any type of conflict that would provide anybody with some kind of advantage or information that ought to be disclosed when a board or commission member or an employee or an appointed official has something upon which they might be voting on. So I think and again, this is a disclosure form. This is separate and apart and broader than what the Ethics Act requires. The Ethics Act does not cover all boards and commissions. It only covers a certain limited set of boards and commissions and elected officials and solicitors and managers. But it will not cover, some of your advisory board members. So this is to bring all the other stakeholders, volunteers, boards, commissions, et cetera, that are covered under here into this process, so there's full disclosure as to things that come in front of them in their official capacity.
Very good. So in your opinion, the appearance or perceived conflict should be included to appropriately broaden the spectrum of things that would be covered?
I'm fine with that,
Very good.
Don. That's,
What's the meaning of contributor in 1E? What does that statement mean? Member of a governing body or of a contributor to Radnor Township.
well, that came from the auditors, but my reading of that is that that's somebody that contributes money or services, in-kind services to the township. Could be materials, could be trees, could be money, it could be personnel. I don't know if Bob agrees with me on that, but that's the way I read that. But that is something that the auditors was in their template.
All right, so appropriate in your opinion to keep it? Obviously?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe if I can just add to that too, it also, I believe, can be interpreted as though those entities in which the township also contributes to those entities, such as the library or other entities where we contribute money to, being on that governing board as well.
Does this document put any burden on volunteers? Any liability, excuse me? Meaning if someone through good faith did not fill out a form accurately, do they have some liability with that? A good
No.
faith mistake?
No.
Very good.
I mean, legal liability.
Yes,
No.
very good. And then what's the meaning of, I mean, I think take any action deemed necessary is too broad, but you don't feel that that's too broad? I mean, we don't know what that could mean because it could be any action.
Could be nothing at all. It's going to depend on what the person's official capacity is with the township. It's going to depend on whether or not there's something that's in front of that person and the board that they're sitting on, if it's a board.
Or also among our board, correct? I mean, this would apply to this board governing itself.
It would apply to elected officials. Correct.
And so we could, conceivably, this board could use that provision to prevent another board member from voting on an issue that this board believed that member was conflicted?
That's a discussion you would have to have. I guess the discussion would also include whether or not the State Ethics Act would come into play in terms of recusing yourself from something that would fall underneath that. I mean, this is a policy. This is not a law. This is not an amendment to the code. This is a conflict of interest policy. Really doesn't have penalties in it, civil, criminal, or otherwise. But it's a policy that the board, assuming you adopt this, course of conduct that you've all agreed upon is a good course of conduct to go forward. And, I mean, I would hope that it's not used for any reason other than to make sure there's full disclosure.
Very good. Well, at this point, my opinion is that this is going to introduce more uncertainty than it's going to solve, and that provision in particular is problematic. So my opinion is that we should reject it and replace it with an expansion of the disclosure form.
Any further, are you finished, Don? Any further commissioner comment? I'll just make a brief comment. I think this document is preemptive in nature. I think the goal here is to raise self-awareness among the elected officials, appointed officials, and administration in the township. I think no one would willingly, knowingly create a conflict of interest, but by requiring this form to be filled out, we stand a better chance of making sure that that doesn't happen. I do have some concerns over the wording, but I recognize this is the resolution is going to be voted on, but the conflict of interest policy is an administrative policy, and it is subject to revision and change over time. I am not as comfortable with the wording in terms of perceived conflict of interest. That's a very subjective term. I also would like to know, I'd like to know that when this is implemented, that we understand the standard in which we judge conflicts of interest. Is it the state standard? Is it a federal standard? The state standard is pretty clear in terms of conflicts of interest. The basic limit is that if your actions in public provide any form of private pecuniary benefit, and that's subject to de minimis limits. So what we're not stating in here is what is the gauge, what is the metric that we'll use to make that determination. I assume we'll just default to the state standard, which is fine.
There is a definition in here, though.
Well, we have conflict of interest, but I read through that. I'll read it. It means a conflict or an appearance of a conflict between private interest and official responsibilities of a person in a position of trust. Persons in a position of trust include Board of Commissioners, staff, members, officers, members, and various boards, commissions, and volunteers of the Radnor Township. But I think there's something missing there. Just in my own thoughts, I thought that it would say at the end of that first sentence, in effect, in which personal private pecuniary benefit will occur as a direct result of their official action. Private benefit may include monetary as well as tangible benefit that exceeds the minimum value. Benefit, i.e. benefit to themselves or any organization in which they are an active member or in a leadership role. My only concern with I think we should vote on this. I think it's fine in its current form, but I think I'd like to see this evolve to something that's a little more explicit so that when there is an issue, it's not an interpretation. It's a very black and white administrative policy that we can all follow. So, I don't know, John Rice, do you have any thoughts on that? Do we need to be more specific, or should we?
Well, I have circulated many drafts of this policy, and we worked off something that was a lot more complicated last year that had and tracked more so the pecuniary benefit language, which is in the State Ethics Act. I mean, conflicts of interest, to some extent are in the eye of the beholder, and where, what their position is regarding a certain thing. The state has an explicit definition of conflict of interest. This is much broader. And I think it's broader, and I think it makes some sense that it's broader because the State Act doesn't cover everyone you're trying to cover with this policy. So, I would suggest that the board adopt this at this point, and I think it is an educational tool for your boards and commissions and your volunteers. A lot of folks won't realize that there may be a conflict in dealing with certain township business matters because of the rules that the township has to operate under. But it's broad, John. I agree with you. I would hope that it doesn't get abused by residents. or by the township, but I think it's something we're going to have to deal with. And I think the important thing is the disclosure form. That puts, you know, I mean, if we're going to be a little bit broader than what the state requires, that's at this point probably a good thing. And I think we need to see how it gets applied over time.
I'd like to move that we adopt the conflict of interest policy as reflected in resolution number 2011-31.
I think it's already been moved and
Yeah,
seconded.
we already had a motion. All right. Any public comment?
Yes, Martin Heldring, 305 Audubon Avenue. I have a couple of comments and a question. First of all, I'm glad, as I've commented previously, that this is coming forward. I think it's been mentioned in the last few audits, so I think it's a good thing. I think just the fact that there are so many questions from board members indicates that there's still some ambiguity in this. And in reading the Pennsylvania Ethics Act, there's a sentence that's early on in the Ethics Act that I think is unambiguous, and it provides that public office, which could easily be extended to not just public office, but anyone who's working for or on any committee for Radnor Township, is a public trust, and that any effort to realize personal financial gain through public office other than compensation provided by law is a violation of that trust. That's unambiguous. And I think with that sentence embedded in this conflict of interest policy, a lot of these questions begin to go away. There's no doubt about what a conflict of interest is if you have that kind of sentence in there. That's my feeling. So I would encourage that to be included. Second point is a question. There's a reference in the resolution to the Radnor Township Home Rule Charter. I could find that. The Pennsylvania State Ethics Act I could find. The Radnor Township Code of Ethics. I find the Ethics Board. But I did a, maybe I'm brain dead, but I did a manual search, and I did, you know, in your search thing, Code of Ethics. I can't find it. So am I missing it somewhere, or does it exist?
It does exist. I have a copy of it.
So how do I, maybe somebody can tell me afterwards how I can find it. Because, you know, you would seem to think it's the kind of document that if you just put in Code of Ethics, bang, it pops up. A lot of other things pop up. You get a lot of other things, but not that.
It's part of the administrative code.
So, okay, I'll look for it there then. Yeah. And then the last point is, I'm a little bit nervous about the last parts of point 3 and 4. And they are referencing essentially that the person who has the conflict would not be present unless there's clarifying information in a discussion or debate that would require his or her presence. But that and then in 4, it goes on to say he wouldn't participate in any final decision. Now, I serve on a number of boards. I'm a banker. The practice, I've never seen that in a conflict of interest policy. The practice for us is if we're on a board and there's an issue relating to the bank, we leave the room for the entire discussion. If there's any questions that come up relating to that discussion, I refer them to someone else in the company. I don't even answer them. And I'm called back into the room when the decision's made. So I have absolutely no role whatsoever in the decision. So it takes away not only the direct influence, which would be a vote, which you could get around with just a recusal, but the indirect influence of being in the room. It might influence someone else who's voting on something if the person who's going to benefit from it is sitting there for any period of time. And of course, any points of clarification they might provide presumably might be influenced by the conflict they have. So you would want an independent, objective source. So I felt rather uncomfortable with that. And I've never seen it in another policy. I mean, I don't read these things as a job, but I've just not seen it.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just to address that, I believe what this refers to is if there's a conflict of interest brought before the Board of Commissioners, that's what this deals with, not the action of when they're serving on the board or commission as it's working, where the conflict may occur where they have to leave the room. I believe this refers to if there's a conflict and there's a charge of a conflict, that it is in front of the Board of Commissioners.
So that's if I had a conflict, right? I'd be only here for the clarification. But I'm not voting on anything, so it's not relevant for me, really. I'm thinking more if someone's on a committee or one of these commissioners has a conflict, are they potentially called in for clarification?
Martin, I think it is explicit to the board. It says in that paragraph, objected to by any present Board of Commissioners. So this is particular to the Board of Commissioners, and certainly any commissioner can be present during during the conversation, they just can't vote.
Yeah, that's my point. I would be
Yeah.
cautious about that. That's
Well-
exactly my point.
But if I
There's
read it,
indirect and direct
But
influence.
we
but if
can't-
I
we
read it
can't
correctly,
force-
John Rice, if it's a single person objecting, that's sufficient to have them excluded, correct?
Excluded from the vote, but not excluded from...
No, from clarifying information.
Okay. So
So,
someone from the public could come up and protest?
No, by any present Board of Commissioners.
Any
is what
other
it says.
member.
So if any
Okay.
one of us raised the
Okay.
exception, they would have to recuse
Okay.
themselves.
Okay. Well, that was my point. Thank you.
Chip Layfield, Wayne. I haven't had a chance to review this version. It sounds like a lot of my concerns from the original version, last time it came up a few weeks ago, have been met. I was concerned that contractors or people that have contracts with the township of, say, like $25,000 or more over 10 years, that be recognized as a conflict. And similarly, any organization, nonprofit organization that receives like $25,000, $15,000 over 10 years, that be recognized as a conflict. It sounds like that's kind of embodied in here.
Yes.
Great. I think that's smart. I noticed New Jersey uses that as in their template. The other matter is of telling a commissioner that they don't have the right to vote. I don't understand where the board would have that authority to deny a commissioner a vote and disenfranchise those constituents. I don't see it in the charter. I'm familiar with trying to remove commissioners from office, and that's very difficult to do. It seems to me that you'd have to go to an authority. Certainly couldn't be an administrative matter. It seems you'd have to go to a judge or something along those lines. I don't see how this board. I've seen this board in the past go on a kangaroo court type farcical quest. They turned out to be just a partisan witch hunt. So could that happen again? I think it certainly could happen again, and I don't like the idea of the board telling any commissioner that they can't vote. I think you could bring a censure and say that you're opposed to it and put it on the record, but denying the vote, I don't see where you would have that authority.
I'll have John Rice comment on that. I think I may have misstated in 3, it essentially is looking for self-selection as we presently have. So if any board of commissioner member or any member of a board or commission recognizes their conflict of interest, they need to self-select out. They need to recuse themselves from the conversation and the vote. However, in item 3, it does say that by any single member of the Board of Commissioners, we can allow that person to actually remain if they want to contribute to the conversation. But they would still, in essence, need to recuse
By what
themselves from the
authority?
vote.
Where would you get the authority to do that?
Well, no, we would be granting them, we would actually be saying to them, no, you can actually be part of this. So if you're asking where we get that authority?
No, where do you get the authority to deny a vote?
No, we don't have the authority to
Nobody would
deny.
deny a commissioner a vote.
No, we don't have that authority.
Just, I
based
mean,
on
the
where-
State
I think
Ethics
we do
Act,
in this.
if there's a conflict of interest as defined by the State Ethics Act, then that commissioner has to recuse him or herself
Correct.
from a vote. I mean,
No, I understand that.
that's an issue that I've seen brought to the attention of a commissioner by other members of the board, but
That's a higher authority.
right, it's a higher authority. So this, I mean, I think, again, this is a policy. This is a policy that if there's a consensus on the board to move forward with it, it's going to be a policy that the individual commissioners or other members of the elected board, appointed boards, committees, volunteers are going to have to basically self-police themselves.
So you don't envision a commissioner or a group of commissioners telling another commissioner, you can't vote on this item?
I don't envision that.
And there would be no authority for them to?
I'm sure I'll be refereeing that. if
But there would
that
be no,
happens.
do you agree there'd be no authority for this board to tell another commissioner?
I
they're
believe
not?
that would be difficult for a board member here to ignore the policy and then vote despite the fact that they would have a conflict of interest.
Or
I'm not going to,
perceived-
I'm not.
Perceived conflict, right?
Or a perceived conflict.
Okay.
But I think in that case, with the elected officials, you have to fall back to the ethics, the State Ethics Act.
I just worry because this board's, very collegial, they all get along well and everything, but I've seen boards in the past have been very divisive and very partisan. So, I do worry about the Republican minority on the board being protected. Thank you.
But if you take a look at, excuse me for a second, if you take a look at paragraph number 2, it does say that the board shall vote to authorize or reject the transaction or take any other action deemed necessary. Suppose the board deems it necessary to say to the commissioner, you cannot vote. Are you saying, John, that you would offer the opinion at that point in time that it's legally impossible for them to do that?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you have a policy in place that a commissioner decides not to follow, that's something that the voters have to deal with. It's not something that is going to be something that's enforceable unless it falls under the State Ethics Act.
Okay, Baron?
Baron Gemmer, South Wayne. To follow up on paragraph 3, which has been talked about in a different manner regarding the clarifying information. Actually, if you read the first part of that paragraph, it's referring to all boards and commissions. So in addition to being very awkwardly worded by, unless objected to by any present board of commissioners, which is somewhat unclear whether it's the board or a single member, I would suggest that it be reworded to apply to all the boards to say, unless objected to by any member of the body holding such discussion or debate. Because at Planning Commission, you're not going to be there. And if someone decides they have a conflict, the Planning Commission members should be the ones to decide at that meeting whether it's appropriate to get clarifying information. When someone's appearing before you, that would be the alternative. So the top part refers to all boards and commissions, so I think the bottom part needs to also.
Thank you.
Hi, Jim Schneller, St. David's. In paragraph 2, I question the second and third word, full disclosure. I think that's pretty vague, and it could get anyone off the hook by simply saying, well, the form wasn't completed properly, the form was completed, or the conflict was disclosed during the proceedings or after the proceedings. And likewise, is there any way I mean, you could go on and on with this, but I was just wondering if wait a second. The form is necessary at all. Would it be better to submit the form when you personally feel you've got a conflict of interest? Because if someone's there filling the form on January 1st, they don't know what's going to come up at a July meeting. And possibly, if these were just submittable at any time of the year, and for a coverall, perhaps I'd propose you have something in the oath of office. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment? Okay, seeing none. John Rice, I think we're going to put this to vote, but there were some constructive comments tonight. I would hope that they at some point get built into the administrative policy that backs up this resolution. Okay, at this point I'm going to put it to a vote. All commissioners in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Opposed.
Opposed? Motion carries 6 to 1, noting Commissioner Curley's opposition.